I want to tell you about a place that probably exists in your memory whether you know it or not. If you grew up in northern Lake County in the 70s or 80s, or if your family ever made the drive up from the Chicago suburbs on a summer weekend, there's a version of this place that lives somewhere soft in your brain. A beach, cold water, rowboats for rent, a little island in the middle of a glacial lake that somehow looked like somebody put it there just for you. That was Cedar Lake Park in Lake Villa, Illinois. And right now, the land where it stood is being cleared. The trees are coming down, the equipment is moving in, and if you drive past the corner of Cedar Lake Road and Grand Avenue today, what you'll see is not a beach, it's not a park, it's a construction site on its way to becoming a subdivision of roughly 130 single-family homes, developed by Leonard Homes, approved by the Village of Lake Villa. Now, here's where I could just tell you to be outraged. That would be an easy episode to make. They're destroying history, they're paving over paradise, cue the Joni Mitchell and roll the credits. But that's not the honest episode, and I'd rather give you the honest one because the real story of Cedar Lake Park is actually more interesting and more complicated, and honestly more frustrating than the simple version, because it's a story about how things disappear, not with a bang, but with a series of completely legal, completely rational, individually defensible decisions that add up to something that feels like a gut punch. So let's talk about it from the beginning. The story of Cedar Lake begins, as so many things in northern Lake County do, with a German immigrant with enormous ambition and a very short patience for anyone telling him what to do. His name was Ernst Johann Lehmann. If you live near Lake Villa, you know the name. It's on the park, on the mansion, on the road. The man left his fingerprints all over this part of Lake County, and he earned it because without him, Lake Villa might still be called Stanwood, which honestly is kind of a great name, but let's move on from that. Lehmann was the founder of The Fair, a massively successful department store on State Street in Chicago. Think of him as a proto-Marshall Fields, if Marshall Fields had slightly more flair. By 1883, flush with money and apparently looking for a project, Lehmann bought approximately 300 acres of land nestled between two glacial lakes, Cedar Lake and Deep Lake, about 41 miles northwest of the Chicago Loop. He had it renamed from Stanwood. He wanted to call it Lake City, but there was already a Lake City in Illinois, so he settled for Lake Villa. Then he lobbied the Wisconsin Central Railroad to route a new line directly through the area. By 1887, there was a train station connecting Lake Villa directly to Chicago, and Lehmann had built a 150-room hotel and private resort to receive the guests who would pour in and off those trains. And pour in they did. Chicago families, businessmen, vacationers looking for clean air and cold water and something that felt like the opposite of an industrial city in July. This was resort country. The glacial lakes of Lake County were the destination. Then in 1890, Lehmann had a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. The Grand Hotel eventually burned to the ground in 1915. The Lehmann era as a formal enterprise was over. But the culture he created, the idea that this is a place to go to, a place worth traveling to, that didn't die with the hotel. That became part of the identity of the whole area. Now here's where I want to be specific, because a lot of the conversation around Cedar Lake Park involves some fuzzy timeline math, and I think clarity actually makes the story better. Cedar Lake Park, as a formal recreational enterprise, opened around 1948 or 1949. It was established by C. Donald and Dorothy Sherwood as a private beach and resort operation. Think mid-century lakefront amenity, rowboats for rent, a beach, a playground, a snack area, and yes, a small island in the lake that became something of a local landmark. Historically, the land was part of what was called Fowler's subdivision. The recreational use of the Cedar Lake shoreline in that broader area goes back much further, all the way back to the Lehman Resort era. But Cedar Lake Park, as a named operating enterprise, is really a post-World War II story, a late 1940s story. And here's the other thing I want to be honest about. Cedar Lake Park closed around the year 2000 by the late 1980s and the early 1990s, which means that by the time most people started noticing that something was happening on that land, it had already been inactive for roughly 25 years, 25 full years. So when people say they're tearing down Cedar Lake Park, what they're really describing is the final chapter of a story that began closing decades ago. The park closed, the buildings came down, the land just sat there, and now the land is being developed. That doesn't make it less of a loss, I just want to be clear about that, but it does change the nature of the conversation. And I think people deserve to understand the difference between grieving a living thing and grieving something that's been quietly fading for a generation. Before we get into the development, I need you to understand what Cedar Lake actually is, because I think it's relevant. I think it's very, very relevant, actually. Cedar Lake is a glacial lake. It was formed more than 10,000 years ago when the last great ice sheets retreated from this part of the continent, leaving depressions that filled with cold, clear water. Lake County has more glacial lakes than almost anywhere else in Illinois. It's geologically one of the most distinctive regions in the state, and even among its impressive neighbors, Cedar Lake tends to stand out. The lake is the home to Illinois state threatened and endangered species, plural. We're talking about the water marigold, a state endangered plant that may exist in only one place in all of Lake County, and that's Cedar Lake. The fern-leaf pondweed, the white-stemmed pondweed, the grass-leaved pondweed, species that only exist in the cleanest, coldest, most undisturbed glacial lakes, and they have been squeezed nearly out of existence across the state. In 2003, the Lake County Health Department identified 4 state-threatened and endangered fish in Cedar Lake: the banded killifish, black shin shriner, the Iowa darter, and the black-nose shiner, cold water species whose region is limited to the northeastern United States. A retired College of Lake County professor and botanist named Linda Curtis rediscovered the water marigold in Cedar Lake in 1989 and published her findings in 1991. Her description of Cedar Lake was not subtle. She called it an outdoor museum. She said it should be treasured as part of the county's natural heritage. Now, I want to be fair here. The development is on the land adjacent to Cedar Lake, not in the lake itself. And the approved plan does include stormwater management features, trail connections to Grant Woods Forest Preserve, and a pocket park. So it's not as if nobody thought about the environmental context. But developing lakefront land adjacent to an ecologically sensitive glacial lake with 130 homes, roads, and impervious surfaces draining towards that water, it's not a neutral act. Stormwater retention ponds are helpful, but they are not the same as not building there at all. Okay, let's get into the specifics, because this is where the story gets interesting. Cedar Lake Park is private property. It was always private property. It was never a public park in the way Lehman Park is a public park. It was a private recreational operation, a private beach club, essentially, that was owned and operated privately, served its members and guests, and when the economics stopped working, it closed. And when it closed, it became idle private real estate. And idle private real estate in a growing suburban market, near a lake, near a metro station, near major road access, that has a way of attracting attention. The site sits at the southeast corner of Cedar Lake Road and Grand Avenue. It's zoned UR3A, urban residential, which already supports the proposed density. In May and August of 2024, the Village Plan Commission and Board of Trustees gave conceptual approval to a planned unit development, a PUD, of approximately 130 single-family detached homes. The developer tied to this project is Lenner Homes, one of the largest home builders in the United States. The homes will meet the village's minimum size requirements, 1,800 square feet for a single story, 2,100 square feet for two-story, with lot sizes averaging around 8,100 square feet. Village records indicate that this is consistent with Lakevilla's zoning and with the village's comprehensive plan, which explicitly encourages residential growth near lakes and near the metro station. No major public opposition was recorded in the Plan Commission meetings. And this is the part of the story that I find genuinely worth sitting with, because it's the most uncomfortable part. Everything about this was done correctly. It was private land. The owner had the legal right to sell it. The developer applied through the appropriate process. The village reviewed it. The zoning supported it. The comprehensive plan anticipated it, and it was approved. There was no backroom dealings. There were no corruption accusations. There was no dramatic villainous moment where somebody decided to destroy the community's heritage and then laughed about it maniacally in a dark room. It was a planning session, and it worked exactly the way it was designed to work. Here's the thing about everything was done correctly. It doesn't always feel like enough, because here's what also happened. The community largely found out about it when the trees started coming down. Now, to be fair, the meetings were public. The Plan Commission hearings were on the agenda. The village's planning documents have been available. In theory, anyone paying close enough attention could have seen this coming for years. In practice, most people don't monitor Plan Commission agendas. Most people find out about development projects when equipment shows up, and the landscape changes overnight, and then it feels sudden. It feels like something was done to them, not with them. That gap between technically public and genuinely public is one of the most persistent frustrations in suburban governance. Early stage discussions happen between developers and village staff, concept plans are reviewed, MOUs are signed, and by the time the project reaches the public meeting, where technically anyone can show up and comment, the deal is effectively done. The momentum is there, the alignment is there, the financial incentive is enormous on every side of the table. The village gets property tax revenue from 130 new homes. The developer profits from 130 new homes. The landowner gets fair market value for land that was generating nothing. Every party to the transaction has a powerful economic incentive to say yes. And the people who grew up on that beach, they have nostalgia, they have feelings, they have Facebook posts. Those things are real and they matter, but they don't show up on a balance sheet. And here's why I think this story is worth your time, even if you've never been to Cedar Lake Park. You've never heard of Lake Villa, and you couldn't even find it on a map. What happened here is not unique to Lake Villa. It's not unique to Lake County. It's a pattern that has played out in communities across the entire Midwest, and it goes like this. In the early 20th century, the glacial lake country north of Chicago was the summer escape. Before air conditioning, before interstate highway systems, before every family had a car, places like Lake Villa, accessible by train, offering clean water and cool breezes, were destinations. Private resorts, beach clubs, boat rentals, an entire regional economy built around the idea that natural beauty is worth traveling to. Then, gradually, things changed. Cars made the entire country accessible. Air conditioning made cities survivable in the summer. Interstate highways made it possible to drive to Wisconsin, to Michigan, to anywhere. The small private lakefront resort lost its competitive edge. One by one, operations like Cedar Lake Park found it harder to make the economics work. Insurance costs climbed, liability concerns grew, the membership base aged, and eventually they closed. The land didn't go anywhere, but the use changed. And when land that was once generating revenue from recreation stops generating revenue in an area where housing demand is growing and land values are rising, the math points only in one direction. So what you're seeing at Cedar Lake Park is not a sudden decision. It's the last step of a decades-long transition. The beach closed, the buildings came down, the land sat for 25 years, and now the final chapter is being written in concrete and drywall. The historian who wrote the entry on Lake Villa Township for the Encyclopedia of Chicago put it as plainly as anyone could. Quote, "Over the past decade, the township landscape has become increasingly marked by subdivisions and strip malls, with a corresponding reduction in farm and woodland." Unquote. That was written in 2005. 20 years later, it remains true, and Cedar Lake Park is the latest entry in that ledger. Cedar Lake Park wasn't stolen. It wasn't secretly destroyed in the middle of the night. It was a private piece of land that closed a generation ago, sat unused while the market changed around it, and was eventually sold to a developer in a process that was legal, documented, and for the most part, unremarkable. And that, honestly, is what makes it sad. Not the drama of it, the quiet of it. A place that generations of Lake County families loved, that they paddled rowboats across, that they spent summer afternoons at, and that they've been trying to describe to their kids ever since. It's all slipped away, not through any single act of malice, but through 25 years of inaction, inattention, and the slow, inevitable logic of a market that doesn't factor in sentiment when it's doing its calculations. The beach at Cedar Lake that opened in 1949 and closed around 2000 will become a subdivision around 2026. And if you want that to be the last time this happens in Lake County, well, now you know what to watch for. Dreaming of Disney but worried about the cost? Meet Just the Essential Disney Hacks. This compact guide is your ticket to a magical vacation without the villainous price tag. Learn insider tips on saving money on everything from tickets to meals. Discover how to maximize fun while minimizing your expenses. Don't let budget fears keep you from creating unforgettable family memories. Get Just the Essential Disney Hacks today and start planning the Disney trip you've always wanted at a price you can afford.